What I'd like to start off doing is we'll do a quick intro for some of you guys who may not know some of the other panelists here. So Larry, you want to go ahead and go first?
Sure. Background. Yeah, I was spent 10 years as an officer in the SEAL teams after graduating from the Naval Academy with an engineering degree. And then at the end of my career, actually I was injured a number of times, but eventually had a career-ending injury right at the 10-year mark. And sitting there in the hospital bed, my whole life, ever since third grade, all I'd ever wanted to do was be in the military, and since seventh grade, be a SEAL. And I only ever thought I could destroy stuff like that. That was pretty much all I thought I was good at, or lead others through destruction. And I didn't think there's going to be much else for me after that. And it was actually my fiance, now my wife and business partner. She has a master's in international security and anti-terrorism. She was working in the intelligence field while I was out on the front lines. She came up with the concept that utilizing our unique skill sets and backgrounds, we could continue to defend the country through education. So for the last 12 years, we've run a series of different training companies. Really, our big specialty is behavior change. And for the last 7 years, we've been implementing behavior change within organizations, primarily around leadership and management. And so that's what we do. We teach processes and systems to enable individuals to lead better through managing their own behavior and influencing the behavior of others.
I love it. Adam?
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm a virtual CFO based out of Northern Virginia, and I help clients make proactive, informed decisions instead of reactive, uninformed decisions. So, it's basically just giving people clarity on where the money's coming from, where it's going to. And my background is on the accounting side, doing taxes, bookkeeping, payroll for businesses, all that kind of stuff. And then before that, I was an actuary for insurance companies. So numbers have always been my biggest thing, and I'm very easily able to translate between the numbers people and English. So that's one of my biggest strengths.
Love it. That's definitely an area that a lot of people are lacking in. For those of you who may not know my background, I, like Larry, come from a military background, Marine Corps veteran, and started a company after I got out. That failed miserably. And then from there, started my next company. And I've been doing marketing pretty much since about 1998. So going on about a little bit over 20 years now. Worked with companies all the way from giant companies like the Hilton, all the way down to tiny companies, and just been focusing on SEO and social for the last probably 15, close to 20 years out of that entire marketing experience. So that's it in a nutshell. What we're going to do today is we're going to touch on 3 topics that are really important during, if you're pivoting a business during a crisis, which is obviously something that a lot of us have to do because business as usual is just not going to work. We want to touch on a couple of aspects. We want to touch on the marketing component. We want to touch on leadership, and we want to touch on finance. Larry is going to be talking a lot about the leadership side of things, and Adam will be talking about the finance side. And obviously I'll be talking about marketing. So one of the things I want to start off by talking about is I want to talk about leadership and then hand it off to Larry. But from a marketing perspective, and a really important aspect of leadership is right now, we're in a crisis. Larry, I know you can attest that, when shit starts blowing up, people are looking for that leader. And that's where we are right now. And whether it's your own industry or the local business community or the larger, business community as a whole, when something goes south, whether it's this COVID crisis or we had the crash in 2008, or some of you are old enough to remember the .com bubble, when something like that happens, people are looking for a leader. And, from a marketing perspective, people are buying from someone that resonates with them in a certain way. So if you're demonstrating leadership, they're going to buy from you because of what you stand for, what you stand behind. If you're out here retracting like everyone else, it's going to present a very different image of you as a person and your brand for both the personal brand and the company brand. On the other hand, if you're standing up and you're contributing, you're sharing valuable information, helping to keep people calm, offering ideas and insight and things like that, then what you're doing is you're creating a lot more value for your brand because you're demonstrating leadership. I want to turn this over to Larry for a little bit and let you talk a little bit on the leadership side from that perspective.
I want to start with speaking on what you were talking about is, okay, why do people look for leadership or look to leaders in either a time of crisis, uncertainty, and fear, right? And those are really, I think, the three hallmarks of the environment we're in. Is it's all starts with uncertainty. And that uncertainty, whenever we don't have a perception that we can control our environment, the natural physiological reaction is to feel fear. And from that fear comes a key thing, inaction. And when you're in inaction, especially in a time of crisis, one of the hallmarks of a time of crisis is a lot of change, right? And ultimately, that's what has a lot of people scared. Is we know, one, our lives are very different today than they were 4 or 5 weeks ago. And the other thing we know for sure, if you're paying attention to anything, is our lives are going to be different in 5, 6, 8 weeks than they are right now. And that causes that change is where we get the opportunity to take action and take advantage of it. And I'm interested to hear Adam's perspective on this. What's been interesting to me thinking about the financial implications of what's going on is in the nature of everything shutting down, well, not everything, but a large, 80% of things shutting down, the money, it's the same amount of money around, it's just moving in a completely different way, and or a lot of it's not moving, which to me looks like there's going to be a buildup of opportunity, right? Because all that money that used to be moving that's sitting there still right now is going to go somewhere at some point. And so for me, when it comes to that question of why is leadership important at this time, the biggest thing first is to be able to make sure that the people that you rely on for support aren't stuck in inaction. And that takes some skill as a leader to be able to keep people moving when they aren't moving, right? I know Jeremy could probably attest to this. You know, when we were standing, this was inevitable. When as we would say, the shit hit the fan, right? When everything went bad, there's 3 things that occurred. The first thing is you would see the people that would be on the ground, unable to move, right? Just stuck, absolutely unable to move. Then the next group of people were the ones that, as soon as you yelled at them to get up, they got up and were able to move. Some people never get out of that freeze. And then there were the people that yelling at the others to get moving, right? So those are the ones that after the initial shock are into immediate action. Those are going to be the ones that have to lead through that time frame. So being able to look through those that you rely on and say, okay, where are the ones that are absolutely stuck in complete inaction? Where are the ones that are able to react to direct control or direct influence, and which are the ones that are already taking effective action? And oftentimes those people aren't the ones that are tied to their positional authority. Just because they have a management position doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be the ones in effective action. And so one of the big hallmarks of what enabled our teams to be so effective is that we had a backwards understanding of leadership and management. And this one key point is the big one I wanted to make, is when we look at leadership and management from the perspective of a SEAL and a SEAL team, it provides a lot of opportunity based off of what I've found working with hundreds of organizations looking at it backwards. So the traditional understanding of leadership and management is that leadership is what you aspire to, right? That visionary leader standing at the front, telling everyone, follow me into whatever adventure you have in store for you. And managers were this necessary evil that you needed to kind of manage and organize getting people moving. Does that, at this point, I know most people are mute, but does that kind of resonate, that understanding of, we want to be this great leader and we have managers that kind of have to implement? Does everyone kind of agree? At least see a couple heads shaking on that. Well, within that is 180 degrees off. That's exactly backwards from how a SEAL team looks at leadership and management. In a SEAL team, my job as being an officer was to manage my team, right? So I had positional authority by being the lieutenant or the platoon commander in the unit. And within that management responsibilities, my core responsibility as a manager was to create, enable, and support leadership at all levels in my organization. My job, if I had to lead as the manager with the title, then I was horribly managing, right? The fact, if I had to get in and do stuff and tell people to do things, take action and evoke action, then I was not building the leaders that my organization needed to be successful. So the most effective managers out there don't ever lead. They create leaders and they follow those leaders. Now, in times of high stress or high risk, everyone has to be able to be an effective action, and everyone has to be able to evoke effective action in others. And what we're saying in that is everyone has to lead. And so when you shift the mindset of, especially I would imagine many of you have the positional authority of management, your job is not to be the visionary leader in the middle, evoking action in others. Your job is to create that opportunity for those within your organization. Why this was so critical, I'm 6'3", over 200 pounds. Being big, tall, and having rank meant that whenever we were in training, I was the first one to die, right? Immediately, the instructors were like, "You're dead." The reason being is I had positional authority. If I hadn't set up my platoon to be able to take effective action, if I hadn't set up my platoon so that individuals could lead when needed, we would all die. And so as soon as we got into any training, I died. Okay, all of a sudden I can't lead my platoon. The next thing is I was big, so someone had to carry my heavy ass around the battlefield. So within that perspective, within your organization, in these trying times, in these times of high change, in these times when we aren't all in the same place, where leadership's very easy, if you haven't espoused that understanding that the primary role of a manager is to create, enable, and support leaders, and the primary role of a leader is to take effective action first, therefore evoking effective action in others. And when you look at that definition or distinction for leadership, all of a sudden, you can understand how leaders and followers shift back and forth very regularly. You know, whoever is in the most effective action leads and everyone else follows. Most organizations, it doesn't work that well or that easily, right? The transition from leading to following is high cost and it takes a lot of time. Those type of organizations aren't going to be able to exist in high risk, uncertain, ever-changing environments because the pivoting isn't going to be quick enough. So kind of yeah, go ahead, Jeremy.
I just wanted to throw something in there for you, Larry. Something that really goes deep into the concept that you're talking about is, I don't know if you've read Jocko's books. The first one was Extreme Ownership, and then he kind of pivoted from there with Dichotomy of Leadership. I think that's what it was?
Yep.
Those really dig deep into basically what you're talking about right now. So for those of you who have not read those books, I would definitely recommend picking those up. I'd go with the audio version. I think the way that they convey the story, I think really carries a lot of weight and in a way that the print book can't. So definitely check those out. All right, back to you, Larry.
Yeah, so his co-author, his partner in that, Leif Babin, Leif and I were in the same company at the Naval Academy together freshman year. So I've known Leif for 25 years, something like that. Yeah, both very, very good guys. Just to summarize kind of the core points of what I brought up, the hallmark to a time of high risk is uncertainty, right? When you have uncertainty, that's going to drive fear. Whenever you have fear, the thing that how fear shows up in human beings is inaction. And in times of high uncertainty, there's always going to be a lot of change. the last thing you want as an organization is to not be in inaction, right?
Yeah.
We need to be in action, because for me, these are the times of the greatest opportunity, right? While others are frozen, I'm taking, like, I've worked harder and had more work over the last month than we have in years, while I watch our competition just sit there, trying to figure out what to do. So in times of uncertainty, you're going to have fear. Fear is going to cause inaction. What we want is to be taking action in these times. In order to do that, we have to look at leadership and management in a different way than you have in the past. Your job, by having positional authority, by having a title, is to create and enable and support leaders and leadership at every level. What we mean by leadership is we want to drive an environment where our people can take effective action and evoke that effective action in other people. And we hammer in our leaders that leading and following is basically the same thing. Whoever has the most effective distinctions, choices, and actions in the moment is the leader. And there is no ego associated with leading or following, right? Following effectively is as important, and is where most people have to be when you're following someone that has effective distinction, choices, and actions. And so remodeling and changing that language within the organization, and more importantly, changing the expectation that you as the leader are not going to be telling people what to do. What you're going to be doing is creating the environment for them to make effective choices. That's the core point I wanted to cover.
And something I want to throw out there on, you mentioned fear, and that's what, causes most people to just freeze up. The reality is fear, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a biochemical reaction in your body. It doesn't stop you from doing what you have to do. A lot of people think that, some of the stuff that you've done, Larry, or some of the stuff that I've done, they think, oh, like, you have to be super brave. No, you just have to fucking act. Like, it doesn't matter. You're still going to be scared. You just go do what has to be done. And the same applies here. I mean, granted, nobody's shooting at us yet, I guess. But
unfortunately, I mean, we can always hope.
It could make things more interesting.
Yeah.
But the fear is there. You just have to act regardless. It's not going to be the end of the world. And the beauty of that is, once you develop a habit of acting in spite of your fear, you're able to do the right things regardless of what comes in front of you. Our IA drills are a perfect example of that. Larry, what are you going to do if you're ambushed?
I curl up in a ball and cry.
There you go. No.
Yeah.
So for our non-military members, what are you going to do if you're ambushed from the right side there? What are you going to do?
The key thing is to attack, right?
Yes.
And that's attack and present overwhelming force to the threat.
Exactly. So we're not sitting there strategizing, thinking about it. We're taking immediate action that we know is going to have an impact. David, go ahead. You had a question?
Yeah, let me add to what you're saying here. As a leader too, one of the things you can do in the world of judging and assessing where your, like you guys mentioned, lack of action, right? That's one thing you can easily see, but especially working remotely, you may not be able to visualize the lack of action as well. So I use a different language for what you're talking about. Is a little bit different. It's all about, is the individual, when you're talking to them, do they sound like they're in action around the world of like empowerment? Are the things they're saying, are they empowered? If they're not empowered, right? If they're not speaking from an empowered place, they're dealing with whatever it is, whether it's the fear, whether it's the uncertainty, whether they're just, in their head. And so you immediately need to get in action with that individual on your team and have them get really clear that what they're talking about is not related to reality. Because most of the time when there's that fear, it's something we're making up. So just wanted to use that language instead.
David, I love
it's a great point.
I love what you said, and here's a little bit of the a simplified version of the neuroscience behind what you're saying, because what you're saying is absolutely true. All fear is a result of a perception that we don't control our environment. So every time that we are in an environment where we perceive that we don't have some sort of control, we're going to feel fear. Another way to say, okay, if the one side of what you're saying is they're speaking in an empowered way, another way to listen to it is if they're speaking in a victim way, right? Like, this is happening to me. I don't know what to do, right? That concept of them being the victim in the environment is where they are illustrating linguistically that they don't have a perception of control. If they don't have a perception of control, they're going to feel fear. That's why in times of change, most people, especially uncertain change, most people feel fear because they have a perception that they can't control their environment. Why, especially well-trained soldiers, like on the special operations side, we often don't experience the same levels of trauma of lower trained soldiers, because even if we're wrong, we always feel like we can do something, right? We always feel like we can take action. We always feel that we have some perception of control, which then takes care of that fear and that eventual trauma. So what you're saying is 100% true.
Awesome. I want to segue into Adam here now. So, we talked about the fear and leadership and all of this side of the world. And a lot of people from a financial aspect get wrapped up around whether it's cash flow, or they're worried about the business tanking and then having to let employees go or go bankrupt, or whatever the case is. What input do you have for people from a financial aspect when it comes to leadership, Adam?
Sure. First, before I get going, could everyone that's here just post in the chat what industry you're in, just so I have kind of an idea of your, marketing, PR, et cetera, just so I kind of have an idea of the audience. But as far as, leadership from a financial perspective, right now, the biggest thing is cash. Do you have cash or do you not have cash? And all of these programs that the government is putting into place over the last 2 or 3 weeks all go straight to that. There's these PPP loans, there's EIDL loans, paid sick leave for employees, stimulus payments to individuals. It's all about getting cash basically from the government to businesses and to really, Jeremy, that's a interesting occupation there.
Glad I could keep you entertained.
Right. But it's all about moving cash around, because if you don't have cash to be able to operate, you're done. You're out of business. And that's what a lot of business owners are figuring out, because they've been operating on, do I have enough money in my bank account to pay next month's rent and next month's payroll and everything else? And they haven't been looking ahead to say, hey, I have to pay taxes in 6 months. I have to pay myself. I have to put money into a retirement plan. I need to do all these things to invest into my business. I just need to make sure that I, keep all my employees paid over the next, 2 weeks, 4 weeks. And because of running, basically their business on a paycheck to paycheck, standpoint, those are the ones that are, they're going to disappear in the next 6 to 8 weeks, because these cash influxes that they're giving, it's a couple months worth of operating expenses, or not even all of your operating expenses. So if the revenue is still turned off for 3 months or more, but you only have 2 months worth of money, what happens in month 3? People start getting laid off. You stop buying supplies, you stop buying marketing, you stop, you try to cut on the expense side rather than doing the opposite, which is you go out there and you find more revenue. I've seen stories of restaurants that are shut down right now. They're turning themselves into basically farmers markets, where all of their suppliers are saying, okay, bring your stuff in, set it up on all of our tables and all of our booths, and we will be your basically pop-up grocery store. So you can still sell all of your products, because now restaurants aren't buying it, and the people that need groceries, but all the grocery store shelves are empty because everyone, stocked up on toilet paper and hand sanitizer, and they cleared out all of the, produce and meat departments. They need somewhere else to go to get that food to feed their families. So they've completely pivoted themselves and say, well, yesterday they were a restaurant. Now they're a grocery store. So it's, it's those quick-minded activities that they're not looking at the expense side of the equation. They're looking at the revenue side. We need to bring in money to stay operational, to keep paying our employees, and to move forward. And when all of this clears, we go back to being a restaurant again, or maybe because we're actually doing better as a grocery store, we stay as a grocery store at that point. So those are those decisions that leaders are making to change what they're doing. But the most important thing, it's cash, and it's getting that cash in the door, whether that's creating new streams of revenue, or just, completely pivoting to doing something completely different that you weren't doing before.
Adam, you touched on something I want to expand on real quick here. So you talked about, finding revenue opportunities instead of cutting. And I think that's a really important topic. Everybody gets in this fear mode and they're like, well, let me just cut costs. Let me cut marketing or cut this software or cut whatever. Robert Kiyosaki, which one is it? Robert Kiyosaki talked about that a lot in one of his books, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. If you don't mind, expand a little bit on that. Like, I know you talked about the restaurant supply companies or the restaurants pivoting that. Do you have some other examples of companies finding new revenue?
There's all sorts out there, right? There's, I heard this one, I was actually listening to Tea with Gary Vee yesterday, and this woman she's had a seamstress shop for years. And never done really well because it's all custom outfits and custom fittings and things like that. And then she signed a lease on a much bigger space because she wanted to grow, and that lease started March 1st. Well, I guess it was like March 8th. I think she was somewhere in Tennessee. A tornado blew through, and then on like the 20th of March or so, shelter in place started. So she's like, "What am I going to do? I just signed this 5-year lease. I need to do something to cover that rent and everything else." And then all the requests started coming out for, "We need masks." And she's like, "Perfect. I'm a seamstress. I have 20 sewing machines sitting here. I have 20 employees that do everything and anything on those sewing machines." And they started making masks. And first they posted online, and then it actually went viral. They ended up on Forbes. So literally within a week, she went from "I'm going out of business" to now, in the past month, she's been more successful than she ever was for the past 5 years that she's been in business, because she saw an opportunity to create more revenue and went after it. And she wasn't price gouging. She wasn't charging, 10 times the normal cost for a mask. She just had a process in place to be able to create those in bulk, and, went after it.
Adam, I got a kind of tactical question for you. When, as a business owner, and as someone trying to make decisions around what you're talking about with cash flow, and this balance between continuing to invest in, like, one of our biggest costs is in marketing versus kind of building up a war chest of cash. Do you have any guidance around, like, okay, what should those levels be? Like, how much should I have in kind of the war chest versus should I be spending on expanding that concept of between the cash flow coming in as well as that safety net and retraction versus my inclination, as could probably be expected from what we talked about, was to just, I'm doubling down on taking land at this point as opposed to protecting. Do you have any?
Yeah, so you'll hear a lot of financial advisors say you need at least 3 to 6 months of personal money saved up for a rainy day or a crisis or things like that. The same applies for a business. Having 3 to 6 months of cash just kind of sitting there as a cushion, that either one thing, like you said, you can use it to double down on things. It's like, oh, I need to market twice as much right now because I have a service that everyone needs and they need to know about it. So it's looking at kind of that ROI, that return on investment of, if I double my marketing budget right now, am I going to, triple the amount of revenue that comes back from that? So there's a lot of those calculations that go into it. I've learned a few different things over the years. One thing that you want from any marketing campaign is you want to earn 3 times the revenue of what you spent on it. So if you put down $10,000, you need to get back $30,000 for it to be successful. And you really want to have 10 times. So you want to put down 10,000 to get 100,000.
Right.
But yeah, now is definitely a great time, because a lot of businesses, because they are in that fear mode and they're not being led, are going the other way. They're cutting prices. They're doing everything they can just to get some sort of revenue. And that's, the same on the marketing side of things too, is now you can potentially buy more marketing for cheaper.
Exactly.
because the firms that are out there, except for Jeremy's, are going the other way and saying, I'll take your $5 when yesterday it was 15, just so I have that $5. So there's some of those opportunity costs right now that you can really, get into that, makes that investment better. And if you know that what you're going to get out of it, funneling some of that safety net cash to do it is perfectly fine, as long as once that money comes back in, you just funnel it back over there and continue to let it ride.
Two things I want to add on that, Adam, is one, when we do this, we need to make sure that there's a plan, not, just hope, because a lot of people will make the mistake of throwing a shitload of money at a particular idea, and there's no strategy behind it. There's no testing. It's just, let's go throw as much as we can at this, and just it's just going to work. And the reality is most advertising doesn't work, right? Some of the most successful people in marketing, I know some of you guys know Dennis Yu. He is, when it comes to Facebook ads, he's one of the top people without question. And he's regularly at Facebook's headquarters. So he says publicly, this is not, this isn't private information. He publicly says that about 9 out of 10 of his ads that they create fail. But you create sets of ads and you test things, and then you find what works, and then you expand on that, and then further refine that, build out other ad sets based on that. So whatever marketing you're doing, it needs to be, first of all, we're not at Vegas here. We're not putting it all on black. We need to have a plan. We need to have a reasonable amount and put it towards that, and then test and refine and continue to iterate on that. So that's a really important thing we need to think about on that.
Yeah, we're just going to put all that on 00 and go with it.
Right, exactly. So, we talked a little bit about some of this pivot, and I do have an example I want to share. It's not so much a pivot from a revenue perspective, but it is a pivot from an operations perspective. And I know a couple of us here are a member of Board of Advisors. It's a private, high-level mastermind group, and their entire business model was based on these face-to-face meetings once a quarter, which obviously with this whole COVID thing, that's dead in the water. That's not happening. Even if, let's say this is all over with tomorrow, everybody's schedule is already adapted to this, so they're not going to make the next meeting no matter what. So they had to adapt to this situation. They did that by turning the entire business into a virtual scenario. So now, instead of having a face-to-face meeting, which was like a 3-day thing for each of the groups, a total of 5 days. There was a little bit of overlap there. But face-to-face meetings 4 times a year. Instead of doing that, we're now doing meetings via Zoom with experts on various topics. Cheryl and I and a couple of other people were on to talk about marketing a while back. There was a couple people talking about video today. But basically, they take these experts on various topics within the group. We do these webinars where everybody's answering, just like we're doing here. We're sharing useful information, answering questions, brainstorming, all of this. But they're now doing this every single day without fail. So they've taken a bad situation and completely turned it around and created significantly more engagement than they had even before this. So despite there being this chaos and this uncertainty and the inability to do things that you've normally been doing, they now have a tremendous opportunity that they didn't have before all this happened. So it's just a matter really of finding a creative way to adapt to the new normal.
Yeah, and I'd add with what's been interesting watching that transition is I've gotten more value out of the 3 calls I've been on than I have for the last 3 meetings I've been at, where I spent a week and $2,000. And so the important part of the pivot is not just changing, but providing more value. And within that, you got to pay attention to the needs of the individuals within it. I also think a big piece is, like Jeremy was saying with the ads, is it's rinse and repeat. Like I always think of it, oddly enough with shampoo that I don't need, but that concept of, I'm going to see what works. And if it doesn't work, I'm not tied to it. Like, okay, test, it works or it doesn't work. I'm gaining ground or I'm not. Okay, scrap it, next thing, right? Not having my ego tied into having to be right. And that's a big piece for me of, I always approach every situation as if I'm wrong. and I'm trying to figure out why it's going to work or not work, as opposed to trying to think I'm right. And by not having that ego associated with it, I can just move faster.
That's awesome. It's a great perspective, because a lot of people, they're terrified of failing. Larry, in the world that we came from, we're pushed to fail. Like, you're going to reach a point where you're going to fail. There's no question. A lot of people don't have that experience. Once you realize that failure is not actually failure, it's a chance to learn. It's a chance to adapt and find a new approach. I know physically, emotionally, mentally, like, we've been pushed into the ground, and you just have to adapt and find new ways to approach it. So if you look at failure not from the perspective of, well, shit, I fucked up, like, now everyone's going to think I'm an idiot, and instead look at it as, well, I learned a new way that this doesn't work, or I learned a different approach that I can take, or whatever the case is. When you approach it from that perspective, it's a totally different environment. You're on mute.
I am.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Yeah, when it comes to failure, I have two kind of key pieces to it. The first one is I don't actually fail until I quit.
Amen.
Right. All I've done is learned. Right. So as long as I'm continuing to be in action and continuing to attack the problem, I haven't actually failed. So, to me, quitting is the ultimate of thing I want to avoid. The second piece to that is, one of the key aspects to our world was the fact that if you failed on the mission, the wrong person died. So we had this love-hate relationship with failure. We loved to find it before we were on the mission, and we hated it so much that we made sure it never showed up on the mission. And so within that, we planned to fail all the time, like literally planned to fail. So we came up with, in our planning, all of the ways that we could fail, and we solved those problems before we went on the mission. So there's a fine line between saying failure's okay, and ultimately I say failure's okay if we fail quick and we learn from it. It's not okay if I fail more than once. And how do we do that? We use this formula of avoid, mitigate, and back up. So avoid the problem, avoid the failure by doing something ahead of time, mitigate the effects of the failure so that if it occurs, it doesn't hurt that bad, and know that odds are, if it still hurts, right, if it still happens, we have a backup plan that's going to protect us in the worst case scenario. So we're solving every problem three ways. And my team knows it's one of the things they can't stand is they come to me with an idea, and the first thing out of my mouth all the time, and this is the sad part for them, like I feel for them, if it's a good idea, this is the first thing out of my mouth. The problem I see with that is, right, because I can't help my brain to immediately go into contingency planning. What's going to go wrong with something? So they've come to learn, if Larry says, what's wrong, the problem I see with this, that's me saying, good job, you came up with a good idea. And then from there, this is the problem, how do we avoid it? What are we gonna do to mitigate the effects of it? And what's our backup plan? And so one of those pieces tying that into the fear conversation is fear is a perceived lack of control. If as a manager, you're talking to your leaders and giving them the strategies you've thought about for avoiding their fears, for mitigating their fears, and having a backup plan in place as a safety net for them, they're going to be able to take action so much more effectively.
I love it. What I want to do is throw a topic for you to expand a little bit on, and then I want to pass this over to Adam here after that. So what you're talking about is something that could be implemented in every business. Explain a little bit about Op4 or red teams and how that works, and then we'll talk about how they can use that in their business. And then after that, Adam, we're going to bring you back up again.
So Op4 or red team was the group of individuals whose job it was to be the enemy. So to be able to attack us in training and or to pressure test defenses. And to me, that's my job as a manager, is to be Op4 for my team. Right. My job as a manager is to take they're the leaders, right? So they're leading on the projects. It's my job to be the bad guys trying to break their project. So trying to break what they're trying to do. That's contingency planning. That's my job to identify the contingencies that are going to show up and cause them to have problems. In order to do that, And this is a critical aspect back to that distinction between managing and leading. A leader is in the trenches with the troops getting stuff done. A manager is in the back, providing direction, support, and safety to the leaders. If you're leading, there's no way for you to have a broad enough picture of what's going on to do the contingency planning, right? You're too busy doing. So by creating that leadership and that environmental leadership within your team, that gives me the space to stay back and have a bigger view of the picture and be able to think ahead of what's going on so that I can identify the problem that I see with their plans, to be able to then present to them the opportunity to come up with the avoidance, the mitigation, and the backup strategies. So that's what I'd have to say about it. Like, it's my job as the manager to be op for.
And that's something I don't think the average person has any idea how much of that takes place.
How much time it takes. Like that, you can't be busy and do planning and pressure testing. Like, you have to clear yourself from that busyness.
Right. I mean, any given mission that we did, we would plan the hell out of it, test out theories, test out ideas, because every idea you have, how's the saying go? A plan goes to hell when as soon as the first bullet goes.
Yeah,
something along those lines.
It's like Mike Tyson's. No one has a plan, or
until they get punched
plan,
in the face.
Yeah, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Right.
You have a plan if you get punched in the face when you plan to get punched in the face. Like, I always had a plan for getting punched in the face because I knew people were trying to punch me in the face. so it's that same concept. Yeah. Right.
So I want to pivot on that and talk a little bit about, planning and strategizing, putting holes in the idea from a financial perspective. Adam, I know this is an area that a lot of people go wrong. I've talked to somebody and they're like, well, we're going to take, 20% of the market share. Well, okay. Well, why, how do you know that? Well, because that's what we need to do. Okay. But like, all of the groundwork leading up to that is not there. So like, how do we plan properly and realistically so that we don't, have these kind of mistakes?
Right. The way that I always look at it is that when and basically it's called budgeting, and it's an amazing, thing that most businesses don't do, is that you budget ultra conservatively on revenue and ultra aggressively on expense. So that way, if either one of those goes the other direction, you're happy. Because if your revenue comes in better than what you expected, great. Or if your expenses don't go out as much as you thought they were going to, great. But if you do the other way, where you do aggressively on the revenue and conservative on the expenses, because you're like, oh, well, then I have all this extra cash laying around, it's never going to work out. So it's, one is having realistic expectations. Saying that you're going to do 20% of the market share, it's like, well, yeah, that you might get to that point, but that's probably 5 years from now. You need to do baby steps to get there. Maybe the first year you're going to do 2% market share. Well, what can you actually do based on revenue from 2% of that market share instead of 20? Obviously, that's a 10 times cut in what your grand scheme of, the perfect world happened. So it's looking at those things and knowing people that have the expertise to, tell you, sorry, that's just not reality. It's just not going to work. And if it does, fabulous. You will be so happy if you budgeted for 2% market share and got 20 and spent expenses based upon that 2% market share. So it's realistically, it's looking at those pieces and knowing what is, what can truly happen and what is just, shoot the moon, dreamland.
I have a question for you. So you budget revenue conservatively and expenses aggressively. That end of that month, you go and look like, okay, we did that and we had this money that wasn't expected because we did that. What do? Do you use that to then tighten your estimate, or do you put that cash somewhere else and use the same ones? What would you do after you were successful in being aggressive and conservative?
It's a great question.
You do all of those things. So one is, you set some of it aside because, you're going to have to pay taxes on it eventually. You're going to, you want to set some money aside for a rainy day. You might want to hire a new person, and it's going to take time to onboard them, and they're not going to be creating revenue right away. So you take that extra cash and divvy it up, and then, you redo your projection and say, okay, last month we did this. This month we should do at least that or more, and hopefully more. And you keep tweaking the projection. So it's not just a one time a year, you do this and you're done. It's a continual process over and over again, just like with testing in marketing. Test, fix, break, that's broken, fix it, that's working, pump more money into that. So the same thing with your cash flow. As you get, better information on what your market is and what products they're buying, what products they're not buying, you change the course and you change that direction. And unless you're looking at it on a very regular basis, you're using old data. A lot of business owners, they look at their finances once a year when they do their taxes. Well, by the time they do their taxes, and if they file an extension, some of that data is 20 months old. Data from 20 months ago doesn't, definitely right now doesn't help you. You need data from 20 minutes ago or at most, 20 days ago. So it's continually, going through those processes and making them so they're actually a process. And so you actually spend time on it, because that's one of your tasks as, like you said, as a manager, is to manage those processes, and your finances is one of those processes. And unfortunately, a lot of people aren't comfortable with it, or they don't know what pieces to look at to get there. And so they just look at the bottom line and say, okay, I made money, I'm good.
I love it.
One of the aspects.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Jeremy. One of the aspects, at least on our journey as a business related to that, was tied to that perception of control and fear. When I wasn't paying attention to our numbers on a regular basis, there was a lot of fear associated with it because I didn't feel like I could control the numbers. And so I hid from it. And that doesn't work, right? The numbers never get better when you put them in the dark. And now that I'm on a weekly meeting with my CFO with that, what's interesting is by facing it head on, I gained that perception of control, and I started taking effective action, and everything got better. And so I completely mirror what you're saying, is that the less you pay attention, the less perception of control you have, the more fear you have. The more I paid attention, even if something was ugly, I at least had this perception of control and I could take effective action.
Love it. All right, now we're going to touch a little bit on some of the opportunities that are out here. And something I do want to point out is once this webinar is wrapped up, we're going to do a recap email. I know we've all shared a lot of information, and there's going to be a lot more to come. Don't worry too much about the details of it. We're going to drop that in the email out to you guys after this is wrapped up. So there will be links to everything that we're talking about that's going to be in this webinar. So just keep that in mind. So from an opportunity perspective, we talked earlier about how a lot of people are pulling out, they're retracting, which that's caused the cost of advertising to go down dramatically. That means you can now get a hell of a lot more exposure for the same or less cost than you could have ever gotten before. I do want to point out that that's going to change. It's not going to stay at that level. People are already starting to get back into it. So if you jump into it now, you've still got a good chunk of time before the costs go back up to what they are. And this is not specific to a platform. So I mean, I think it was Facebook was somewhere in the range of 30 to 40% below what they had normally been. But we're seeing this across the board. So whether we're talking about, banner ads on a website somewhere, or Google ads, or, advertising within someone's email newsletter, whatever the case is, generally most advertising cost is down, and you could probably negotiate it even if they're offering a particular price that is not within your budget. So now is the time to strike on that. When we talk about this, what I do want to do is I do want to touch on is we need to leverage what we're doing. And this is something we should be doing anyway, but right now it's especially important. So, everybody focuses on the front end of that funnel. And when I say funnel, I'm not specifically talking about a funnel. I'm just talking about the buyer process, right? From getting exposed to you to buying your product or service. So people make the mistake of they'll put up an ad and they'll try to sell somebody, sell that thing right then and there. And that's generally not going to happen. However, you take that whether it's first point of contact is a post on social media or a Facebook ad or an ad on some other website, what you want to do is get them into your cycle so that you can continue marketing to them. That might mean getting them to sign up for an email list. That might mean getting that Facebook pixel fired so that you can then continue to market to them through Facebook. Same applies for Google. Or you might get them to come join a private group. The idea is not to sell them in that first hit. The idea is to work them into the mix and then continue to build that relationship. So, let's talk about email for a second. That's a great example. We've all got the ability to market to people via email. I mean, you could buy a service from MailChimp or Aweber or Constant Contact. There's countless opportunities to build your list. You have to provide value before they'll sign up for it, though. So a good way to provide value to get them to sign up, like this webinar is a great example of that. Another example might be you've got information in your head that they need, right? So Larry, you might have, I don't know, 6 principles of Navy SEAL leadership, just for an example. All right, it's already something that you know. You turn it into a document, and then they sign up for your listing and go get that once they've signed up. There's a ton of content out there. All you have to do is look at the kind of things that your customers are asking you, the questions that you're regularly getting, that you're having to regularly answer. And if nothing really comes to the top of your mind, go look through some of your old emails, dig through there and see what kind of questions people are asking, especially in the sales process, because that's when they're not yet knowledgeable about what you do and how you do it. You can take answers to those kind of questions and turn that into a way to get them into your list or into your Facebook marketing or whatever approach you want to take there. So if we can leverage these things together, so let's say you get somebody in your email and now you've also got them, you're remarketing to them on Facebook and Google, and then you do a joint venture with somebody and now they're mailing to their list, who that person happens to be on, about you. You start putting all of these things together and you get a dramatically more powerful effect. One of the examples I want to share, and this didn't cost a damn thing, I created a group on Facebook for supporting the local business community. And all that I was doing was sharing information that was useful for business owners. I wasn't even doing it from the perspective of, creating any business out of this. Invited a bunch of local business owners, people who lived in the local Tampa area. And I've been doing this for, I don't know, this is probably 2-3 weeks, not even that, maybe 2 weeks. As a result of that, a local news channel reached out to me to have me on the show to talk about this. So these are the kind of things that you guys can be doing to create more exposure and leverage what you're doing out there. I touched on how it's important not to try and close it right out of the gate. That's a really important part. I see a lot of these ads on Facebook where they're like, hey, come buy this, brand new thing, whatever it is, a coaching service, a business service, whatever it is, but that's literally their first contact. A better approach to that is you create a series of short videos. They don't have to be anything crazy. David, we'll use an example. So David does drug testing for companies. So an example for him could be, we talk about how the COVID-19 thing is affecting drug testing, right? There was a myth going around for a while that DOT drug testing was suspended because of COVID-19. That's ridiculous. They're not going to stop drug testing drivers who were following DOT regulations because of this. So that would be an example of a video. Run that thing, get people, target it to transportation companies, airlines would work too, but small airline companies or private pilot type things. Run that, start building that relationship. And then from there, you can encourage them to go and sign up for more information on the DOT regulations during this time, or talk about updates to the DOT. There was recent stuff there. So then you work them further into it. It's no different than going to a networking event. You're not going to walk up to somebody and be like, hey, I've got this awesome thing. Do you want to buy it right now? They're going to tell you to get the hell out of there. So if you build that relationship of trust, you're going to get a lot better results. As far as opportunity go, Cheryl, since you're here, we might as well touch on PR as well. Right now, a lot of the journalists are sick of covering COVID-19. It could be a great time to reach out and get a story in the media. A lot of people do that wrong, though. Do you want to talk a little bit about that for a second, Cheryl?
Yes. So there's more interest and more opportunity than ever. What we find being the help and also the hindrance is that so many people who want to participate with the press mistakenly think, I want to be profiled, I want to be featured, I want this to be about me. That doesn't work. Biggest fail. Yes, they are sick, beyond sick to death of hearing things. One young man came to me last week and said, I'm seeing it in my head. Here's the answer to COVID. And it's some guy with a startup company with an app that will coalesce all information. Said, no, they will kick you out of the door. But providing value add in terms of firsthand stories that talk about what you did before and what you're doing now, the indications that you're seeing. A man on the street business or women or person on the street talking about, I realized this is the new normal. Here's what is working now. Here's what I'm inspired by. Here's where I was scared to death or fell flat on my face. So that is something that is helpful, interesting, meaningful to everyone. More opportunity than ever before for opportunities like that. So that could be in your columns. It could be in the source material that you provide. In that, of course, there is the description of who you are and what you're about. So make sure that's thought through and consistent, because that's a big payoff, that you're starting to be present in multiple places. I saw, some of you may know Eric Mitchell, but he's the broadcasting specialist that I've kind of aligned with for some of these opportunities. His personal lament was that while he's well known in the broadcast arena, he'd never really been written about. I took a stab at writing a Q&A article about him. Entrepreneur turned it down flat. Just said, yeah, that comes off as promotional when it's a Q&A that profiles one person, not happening. Put in another article that hasn't appeared yet that cited multiple thought leadership experts on what is your expert opinion? What do you see happening? Combine them together, and I'm sure that one's accepted. It hasn't run yet. But using that same approach, within a period of about 48 hours, he was in Washington Post, New York Times, I believe, AP, multiple, like problem solved. That, you know, forever you've wanted to promote yourself, doesn't really fly, but adding value, always in vogue, always in fashion.
Cheryl, if you, when you're thinking about say you put together a piece that adds value around this stuff, how would you shop that out? Would you just go and say, hey, to different organizations and say, hey, I've got this. Do you have interest in it? Is there a means for getting that into the right hands?
It varies, and that's where you probably need at least some informal advice or to get into those networks. If you do it on your own, actually one thing that I've noted, because people say, how do you pitch? How do you pitch? How do you pitch? And I have pointed out, well, just like any other form of sale, whether money is changing hands or not, it's word of mouth. Well, how do you start that? If you don't know someone, you know, people who are vetting a PR agency and say, who's in your black book? It's the wrong question. Although having that black book is helpful, I think, what is the next best thing to word of mouth from a friend? And that is read that individual's articles and start to respond to them and say, I really like that because I've also got some ideas, and get a kind of recognition and rapport going. They say in classic sales that it takes 6 touches before someone's over the top and they do something. Maybe, maybe not. But that will, if something is really thought through as why it helps me, I'll always read that pitch and I'll always respond to it. But when someone pitches you cold, it's like, you know, dumb luck. It's going to be like direct mail, the old-fashioned kind, and probably about the same percentage response. In your case, I'm fascinated by everything that you said about fear in that last session that we were both in. Got it down. Otter AI is my new best friend. So I have the transcript of it. And it's going to be one of my columns for Entrepreneur. But it's going to be the thought leadership advice from you, not a profile about you. obviously what's about you is background that has the right context. So it's there, but it's not the point of the story. I'm frustrated that I've got 2 articles in the queue that haven't appeared yet. So, it's after that. I wish it were faster. But I'd still like it to be mine because I'm so enamored with it. So that's where we are. But that's a kind of clue that you may not think of it, but so much more personal value add is coming out of all these Zoom meetings we're doing now. That's why, I'll take the transcript of a lot of them because I think of ideas every hour, more than I can possibly follow through on, but then finding the right match for those so that somebody gets to benefit. Not unless it's somebody I know well, or I'm providing a written column just as story in a box. It's like my pitch, but I've painted the car all the way through. It's got colors, names.
Right.
That they can look at and be inspired by, and it's faster than me trying to explain in 2 sentences why they ought to care. That's, or it's somebody I know well enough that I say, you know what, I think this fits you. Do you want it? And yeah, you just saved me some time. So it's a variety of ways, but in every way, it's maybe the extension of word of mouth or being a friend. Become a friend by giving it context, not just, this is something I sent to 100 people. You're one of them, and you write for Forbes, so here you go.
Right.
Not looking at the beat, nothing.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's the approach that most people take. Is they look at it like it's a numbers game. And let me just blast this out to everybody. I know you get a ton of pitches like that, Cheryl. I get them all the time as well. The key really is, like I said, building that relationship. You actually have to care about somebody to some degree in order for them to give a shit about you. But the other side of it is, we talked about adding value, but also you have to tell a story in a compelling way. That's something that Cheryl is great at, but most people, it's bad. So there was an example, Cheryl and Larry, you saw the ad today that I'm going to be talking about. It was not a good ad. It was like just a whole bunch of words thrown on the screen, basically. And that's the kind of thing that people just scroll on by. And the same applies whether we're talking about a social media post or an email or whatever kind of communication you're using. The key is you need to get them emotionally hooked. You need to make it matter to them. And a really effective way to do that is through storytelling. If you can tie a specific thing, an experience that you've had, right? Like Larry, you could probably, write a great example about leadership on like the first, the most important lesson that I learned by failing in my first combat mission or something like that. And if you give like specific details on, painting that picture, make it the point where they can understand that in their head. They can envision, what the environment looked like, how it felt, what it smelled like, what your emotions were. And once you can get them emotionally engaged with that story, they're going to be far more receptive to what you have to say. So when you combine engaging their emotions with something that's relevant to them with actually caring about them, you're going to see significantly better results. So regardless of whether it's an ad or, DMing somebody on LinkedIn, whatever, find a way to do that. Speaking of LinkedIn, I do want to give you guys a quick hack here. Is a lot of times you'll see these automated DMs when you connect with somebody and it's say, hey, great, thanks for connecting, blah, blah, blah. You should check out my stupid link here that nobody cares about. Don't do that. Instead, pick up your phone when you connect on LinkedIn and you've got your DM there. Towards the bottom of the screen, there's a little record microphone button. If you push that, you can just give them a quick little personal voicemail type message. Hey, thanks for connecting. I love that you're doing XYZ. I think that's really cool. Or I saw this post. That's why I connect. Whatever it is, it's something personal. You're going to connect with them on a personal level in a different way than just either ignoring it or just sending some canned bullshit. That's going to really make you stand out. So give that a shot. What I want to do is pass this over to Adam for a second. Let's talk a little bit as we're on opportunities. Let's talk about some of the opportunities. You've been covering a lot of the grants and the programs and stuff from a financial aspect. Let's talk about some of those opportunities for a minute.
Okay. So there are like 5 or 6 or 20 or 1,000 different pieces out there right now. And the caveat that I basically put on everything at this point is that Whatever I say right now, in 5 minutes, it might be different. So the biggest one for small business owners that's out there right now, it's called the PPP. It's the Paycheck Protection Plan. Basically what it is, it takes your average salary from last year for all of your employees, certain things get pulled out of it, and then it takes that times 2.5. Now, one of the biggest issues that's been happening with that is that it's a several step process. So you have to apply through your bank. The bank then has to send it to the Small Business Administration to get certified. They then have to send that back to the bank to approve it to go to funding, and then you actually get your money. Originally they're like, oh, we're going to make this happen within 24 hours. And with any government agency, including the military, things do not happen in 24 hours ever. So there's been a lot of backlash. There's been a lot of negative press and things like that around this. People have been bashing the banks. People have been bashing the government. People have been bashing everybody. And one of the biggest pieces that I'm pushing out there is just patience. These things take time. They just created this $350 billion program. It's going to take a couple minutes for that to actually figure out all the different loopholes that they're going to try to close so that people aren't trying to scam the system. But again, it all really goes back to record keeping. If you don't have all the records to be able to do the application, all the payroll records, tax payments, wages, everything like that, you're going to get an application that isn't complete. The banks are going to decline it or delay it because they're going to need that information from you. And it's going to take even longer for you to get your money that you're applying for. So that's the biggest one. The second one, which came out actually first, was the disaster loans, the EIDL. With those, you could potentially get a $10,000 grant. But if you do both the EIDL and the payment or Paycheck Protection Plan, they actually get rolled together. So you can't double dip and end up with both of them. Then there's sick leave for small businesses. So any small business that had someone that's working for them, if they're a full-time employee, they can get 80 hours of paid sick leave now, whereas before you had to be, I think it was 500 employees and up. And then there's extended family leave. So if you have a kid that is either out of school or out of daycare because of all of this, there's another 12 weeks of paid family leave with certain caps that those employees can get paid for from their companies as long as they're still employed. If the employer decides to let them go, well, then they go over to the unemployment side, and that's one of the other benefits is whatever your base unemployment rate would have been, they're putting $600 on top of it every week from now until the end of July. So like here in Virginia, where I am, the cap that you can get is $368 a week. With that extra $600, you can now get $968 a week. So some of these employers are looking at it and saying, if I lay off this employee, they can get more money through unemployment through the end of July than I would have been able to pay them. I don't have to have that cash flow coming out of my pocket. They're still taken care of and getting benefits. So it can be kind of a win-win for organizations to do that. It might not be the best choice, but sometimes, looking at that cash and things like that, you can do that potentially. It looks like there's a question from Christy. Is that a loan? I'm assuming you're asking. The PPP starts out as a loan, and then as long as in the 8 weeks after the loan is funded, if you use the funds for payroll, rent, utilities, and mortgage interest for the company, so that's like if the company owns the building, then they're paying a mortgage instead of rent. The interest on that loan, if all that goes in that calculation. So let's say you get a $25,000 loan. If during that 8 weeks you spend $25,000 on payroll, rent, utilities, et cetera, that amount would be forgiven. If you use it for other purposes, that amount is not forgiven, or maybe your payroll is just not that high right now. The other piece that isn't forgiven becomes a loan. It's 1%. You have 24 months to pay it back. So it's a very low interest loan. It's something where, again, to help with cash flow, even if you don't use it all for payroll and stuff to get that piece forgiven, you can use it long term because on this day and age, commercial loans generally are 8 to 12%. So being able to get it for 1% is actually a pretty significant benefit there. The EIDL, the $10,000 can be forgiven potentially if that's the only loan that you get. And And there's some people like that don't have payroll, didn't make a lot of money in 2019. So the EIDL could be a potential help to them because you get that 10 grand even if you're declining for the loan. Anyone else have any questions about the wonderful CARES Act and all of its iterations?
If you've already applied for EIDL and the PPP at the same time, they're just going to bundle those together?
Correct. Yeah. So what they'll do is they'll technically refinance the EIDL into the PPP loan. So they'll roll them together into one loan at the end of the day.
If you've applied, and this is specific for me, I applied for EIDL. I haven't applied for PPP. Would it be then apply for PPP now, or just stick with what I've been doing?
So with the PPP, there's a cap on the dollars. So it's $349 billion. Once that $349 billion has been loaned out, right now that program's over. There are the discussions that have been in the news for the last 24 hours or so where the administration is trying to go back to Congress and say, give us another $250 billion. So that would bump it to about 600, just because of the volume of applications that have already come in. But it's, the biggest thing is having the documentation, and then a lot of the banks. So almost every bank is limiting the applications to someone that already has a banking relationship with them. So, so Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, they're saying you have to already have been a customer of ours to be able to apply for this loan through us. Other small community banks have been saying, hey, we'll take anybody and then all we're going to require is at the end of the day, you open some accounts with us, checking account to deposit the money into, and we'll take your application as well. The problem with those smaller banks, they don't have as much logistical support. I have one here locally to me that has like 10 branches. Well, they have 10 commercial bankers. And on the first day, last Friday, when you submit applications, they got over 2,000 applications. But then 10 people had to go through and process and figure out if all the information was there or not. So that is the downside to those community banks, is they just don't have the capacity to be able to process these as quickly as, Wells Fargo or Bank of America that's going to do almost all of it using, their computer space.
Love it.
Any other questions?
Real quick, Larry, question on that EIDL. Now, they're only wrapping the first $10,000 advancement into the PPP. If you're granted a greater loan and you didn't ask for the advancement, that's a different disaster loan, correct?
Got it.
Well, if you they're going to refinance everything into it. It's just that other piece wouldn't be forgivable. So it'll end up just being all loan eventually.
Got it.
All right. Any other questions on the financial side? All right. Larry, I'm going to turn it back to you for a minute. Let's talk about, wrapping this up, let's talk about leadership. What can we be doing to set the right impression for employees, for the industry, for just the general public?
I think one of the big pieces is going back to fear. I like to separate them into necessary and unnecessary fears. Necessary fears are fears that actually keep me safe, and unnecessary fears are the fears that are real and that I feel, but that are restricting my ability to take effective action. I'd say one of the biggest things you can do right now is act with compassion and grace with your employees that have unnecessary fears. Mm-hmm. Right? Not everyone is going to be the one that is able to stand up and take effective action under a hail of gunfire, and being able to address those that are laying on the ground and can't move in a way of care and connection is what they need, not someone yelling at them to be effective. So within that aspect, just because someone is living in fear, living in inaction based on something that is unnecessary, right? Something that isn't really a risk to their life, being able to address that with some care and compassion, I think, is really important in this time, because ultimately we as human beings need connection to survive. We can't survive on this planet without effectively coordinating action with others. And in this time of separation, it's a lot easier to feel isolation. And with that isolation is going to come more fear. So being able to use this as an opportunity as a leader to create connection with people as opposed to more disconnection would be important. And the first way to do that is acknowledge that their unnecessary fears are real. Like, they are real, they're just not serving them. So let's help them be able to move effectively despite those. So my big message would be connection.
I love it. So something I want to close on here is, obviously there's a lot of chaos that's going to create opportunities, but in addition to the normal business side that we're all talking about here, like, we all want to, I mean, we're not ghouls. We're not trying to, profit off somebody else's loss or fear or anything like that. But opportunities are going to be created. Somebody needs to capitalize on that in some way while not hurting people. But that being said, we also need to look at the bigger picture. It's not just about, how many dollars can we snatch up. There's a lot of people that maybe don't have the ability to adapt the way that some of us do, and they don't have the resources. Help give back in some way. I talked about the group that I created where it's basically sharing all kinds of resources and connecting people. Do something like that in your own local community. Or, I've seen a lot of people donating masks, or they're paying somebody to make these masks and donating them to first responders, whatever, things like that. Find a way to give back. I've been seeing a ton of people. I mean, we all hear these horror stories and the doom and gloom, but I've been seeing so many people doing amazing things to give back to their local community, to regular citizens left and right. That's the kind of things that we need to be doing. I mean, we're leaders. It's not just lead the business to make profit, but we need to be building the example that we want to see in this world. So give thought to that as well. See how you can help, how you can contribute and give back. And it's going to make the whole world a better place for all of us. So I'll close on that. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll send a recap email after this with links to all of the resources that we talked about here in the webinar. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.